his involvement in the Balkans in 1999, where, according to Human Rights Watch, 150 fighters were killed and as many as 527 civilians were killed. Similar discrepancies and disparities have been disclaimed for the battles of Fallujah and Ramadi, though exact figures are unavailable. In fact, Israel's Gaza operation may have the lowest civilian-to-soldier casualty ratio of any urban combat operation in recent history. As for the destruction of buildings, Palestinian relief sources say that some 4,000 homes were destroyed, 100,000 people were left homeless. That is certainly a tragedy, but again, one that must be measured in context. Of example, the Battle of Fallujah, where an estimated 300,000 people were left homeless. And many Gazan homes were destroyed not by Israel, but they were destroyed by Hamas booby traps. As Israeli sources advanced, the booby traps would go off in a sequence. Indeed, it is very important to maintain a sense of proportion. True, Israeli forces did not hesitate to return fire at or around UN institutions. UNRWA does employ Hamas members. Yet, according to UNRWA, the UN operates out of more than 2,200 buildings in Gaza. Israel hit 4 of these and apologized for hitting the 4th. It was an accident. Generally, while Israel forces gave greater weight to protecting themselves than to civilians, and this was a departure from previous Israeli policy, the accusation of war crimes, of indiscriminate killing by Israel, are not supported by the statistics, and they reveal, moreover, a fundamental lack of understanding of the realities of urban combat and the abject confusion of battle. If you haven't been there, you can't know what it's like. 40% of Israel's casualties, military fatalities in this conflict, were from friendly fire. And if Israel is so exact in knowing exactly where it's fired, how do we manage to inflict so many casualties among our own soldiers? Another example personally happened to me was one night during the conflict, we got a message on our coded phone, a top-secret message directly from the general staff informing us that 40 infantrymen had been killed by a single mortar round and were trapped under a building. We couldn't get their bodies out. And the IDF proceeded to mount a major, huge artillery barrage to send in helicopters after helicopters, and it turned out the report was false. The general staff even had false information of what was going on the battlefield. It had never happened. 40 soldiers were not killed. Much of the emphasis on the civilian impact of the campaign was the work of the foreign media. And in the years following the Lebanon War, in my reserve capacity, I was involved in efforts to revolutionize the IDF's relationship with the media, and some of my recommendations, including providing field cameras to infantry platoons that will enable them to film actual combat situations and to then project those films immediately in real time on YouTube. Some of those recommendations were accepted, but many others were not. Israel had been deeply scarred by the press's role in the Intifada, in the Mohammed al-Dura affair, which some of you may recall, the shooting, which was almost certainly fabricated. The false reports of that massacre in Jenin, and then again by the Lebanon War, in which Hezbollah succeeded in generally hoodwinking the press. I strongly recommend you read a 50-page paper by Marvin Kalb, written under the auspices of the Kennedy School of Government, which is called How Hezbollah Manipulated the Media War in Lebanon in 2006, a brilliant paper. In this campaign, in contrast to Lebanon, where journalists had basically free run of the entire border area, in this campaign, the Israeli government decided to ban journalists from the battle area. It confined them to a few small hills overlooking Gaza. That's why you saw the same angle on your television set every night. The decision was designed to give the IDF time to complete its mission, and it bore certain advantages and certain liabilities. Though disturbing images of civilian suffering continued to flow from Al Jazeera and other Arab networks, they did not carry the imprimatur of Fox and CNN. Journalists were forced to report on Qassam rockets falling on Israel. In 2006, they ceased reporting on the Katyushas falling in Israel. And journalists did not get in the way of IDF troops. They did not get killed by IDF troops, and they did not get interviews with IDF generals that could later be used against those generals in war crimes trials in Europe. The liability was that the journalists were furious. And that fury was evident from the first night of the war, when the CNN concluded its night of broadcasts with a sort of a montage of images from the war. All of them were of Palestinian suffering, not one image of a Qassam rocket falling on Israel. And as in Lebanon, and as in the Intifada, most of the press diligently reported or repeated Palestinian myths. My favorite one is that Gaza is the most densely populated area on earth. Tel Aviv is twice as densely populated as Gaza. How many times have you heard that one? Most of the press reportedly immediately on alleged massacres without investigating their veracity. Again and again, over the course of the conflict, we had to deal with accusations of atrocities. Most started with the French press quoting Palestinian sources, and then the wire services quoting French press, and within minutes, the Palestinian claims became truth. Israel's response has to be, by law, we are investigating, which after a few days began to sound vaguely Soviet. And that was the case with the UN school. You all remember this incident. Early one evening, we heard that an Israeli troops had exchanged fire with a Hamas mortar team outside of a UN school, and that 10 people had been killed, including 2 senior Hamas operatives. Within minutes, the French press, quoting Palestinian sources, claimed that the Israelis had shelled the school itself, killing 53 people, most of them children. There was no mention of the mortar, of the Hamas mortar. To this day, really nobody knows what transpired at that school, but Israel was nevertheless branded as a child killer, still being investigated. But the worst damage to Israel's reputation came not during the fighting, but in its aftermath. As one correspondent at the time told me, just wait till this is over. Indeed, since the ceasefire, there's been an almost uninterrupted series of front-page articles on Palestinian suffering, allegations of Israeli crimes, including the illegal use of white phosphorus. These articles, it must be said, have not had a significant impact on American public opinion. Professor Lieber mentioned the recent CNN poll. And not all Israelis, in fact, regret that coverage. As one Israeli commentator on TV observed, all those photos of destruction may send a certain and ineluctable message to Israel's enemies. The images from Gaza triggered violent demonstrations in parts of the Arab world, though the West Bank remained notably quiet. Mahmoud Abbas saw to that. The Iranian press was replete with cartoons accusing the Jews of doing to the Palestinians what the Iranians deny the Nazis did to the Jews. But Sunni leaders were generally reserved in their public criticism of Israel, and privately they were rather supportive. Egyptian President Mubarak especially blamed Hamas for the crisis and called for its defeat. One Palestinian journalist, after giving me a very, very tough interview about civilian casualties, pulled me aside and said to me, off the record, whatever you do, don't stop until Hamas is defeated. The crisis revealed deep divisions in the Middle East, perhaps not seen since the Arab Cold War of the 1950s, pitting Syria and Iran against just about everybody else, as evidenced by the failed Doha summit. A more consistent front was presented by the Europeans, who, taking advantage of that gap between American administrations, swiftly asserted themselves. In the Security Council, they rushed through a resolution calling for Israel's withdrawal and opening those border crossings without once mentioning Hamas or the word rockets. The U.S., much to Israel's chagrin, abstained on that resolution. But the real diplomacy was conducted directly with the French, particularly with French President Sarkozy, who came to Jerusalem, and then joined European leaders at a summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, where they pledged to help prevent the renewal of arms smuggling into Gaza. Israel also forged intersecting agreements with Egypt and the United States on preventing arms smuggling, agreements that for the first time are involving NATO. By the end of the third week of fighting, it was clear to many people in Israel, clear to us in the army, that the operation had to end. Barack Obama was about to be inaugurated, and the last thing anybody wanted was for the new president of the United States to have to proceed directly from his swearing-in ceremony, directly to the Situation Room in the White House and start dealing with an Arab-Israeli crisis. Israel had already demonstrated its determination to defend itself. Rocket fire had dwindled to about 20 rockets or less per day. Suddenly, the Lebanon war didn't seem like such a fiasco after all.